My name's Dick Moran. I'm just speaking for myself here. I have two questions. The first one's general. From a tertiary water treatment, does it remove the pharmaceuticals? I'm thinking of the hormones.
That's a great question, and such a diversity of chemicals. It's hard to think about removing chemicals with a single process. A project that we're doing in California to look at equivalency of treatment trains to see, you don't want to just have RO, but maybe alternatives that don't use RO for places where brine would be an issue. We set up some criteria and looked at the ability of the different treatment trains to remove these chemicals of concern, for example. What you find when you're just looking at the sort of health-based risk level of these chemicals, at what point are you dropping them below the level of concern for public health? That a lot of them are dealt with immediately in the secondary effluent. So the biological treatment itself is exceptionally good at removing below the levels of concern a lot of these compounds. And the compounds that have this estrogenic effect, these endocrine disruptors, many of them are very well treated in the secondary process themselves. So for tertiary water, you're getting it actually before you're doing the tertiary treatment. And then there's even further reduction if you're going to apply this onto soil.
That's encouraging. My second question concerns this reuse of water in the Southwest, where we have this as an option, but we presently have conventional methods of receiving our water. How do we know when it becomes practical for us to convert to the sophisticated ways that you've described to us?
Our approach at the Water Authority is to use triple bottom line methodology of evaluating the alternatives that you would come up with. So you look at the social impacts, the environmental impacts, and then just the cost itself, and compare the alternatives amongst them too. So as you start to get further and further along, you get less and less resources, you start to compare those individually against each other, and that's when you start to rank those alternatives based on that triple bottom line approach. Of course, public acceptance is number one, so no matter what alternative you select, you need to go out to the public and be able to share that with an opportunity with the public to provide feedback. What you think from a technically based standpoint or a social standpoint, environmental standpoint may be totally different than what the public believes those to be, so you have to take that out to the public to do that. But that would be the approach that we would use.
One form of reuse that hasn't been addressed is on-site reuse, which is gray water reuse. In New Mexico, there's some of the most restrictive legislation in the Southwest for gray water reuse. And in addition, the building code make it possible legally to install a gray water system. So I'm wondering what we can do to address those issues.
So I think the microphone was cutting out the question.
Shall I repeat?
No, that's okay. I can repeat it. So the question was about on-site gray water reuse at a residential level, and the fact that there are very restrictive regulations that almost prevent individuals from reusing gray water at home. Can you address this question?
Well, gray water usage, was a subject of a legislative bill a couple of years ago, and it is allowed, but there are restrictive ways in which you can do it. So from an economic perspective, if you're building a new home, it's significantly easier to build in a gray water reuse system as opposed to retrofitting an existing home. Of course, which source of supply is always a debate about what is gray water. Is it the sink water? Is it the wash water? What is it? It is proven to be safe, but again, the same question and the same issue that I brought up about these treatment issues associated with just high-tech. You have residential customers that are going to be responsible for these treatment systems, and so as long as they're understood what they needed to do, then it's great. But when they move houses or somebody else comes in, then you have a potential health problem associated with that reuse But it is allowed, and we are seeing more and more of it. In fact, there's an ongoing development project at Windrock, which is talking about doing large-scale gray water reuse for that development. So it is moving forward, just I think at a lesser pace than some of the other alternatives.
Caroline, name and affiliation.
Caroline Scruggs, Environmental Planning at UNM. Thank you all for an excellent set of presentations. And I'm wondering if Mr. Livingston could talk a bit more about how the village of Cloudcroft actually gained public acceptance of the project and the way you went about trying to get the public on board. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that's a excellent question as well. That's really kind of a key component to these projects would be acceptance. What the village, primarily what they did, and of course the threat of running out of water kind of pushes you in a direction. The businesses were always supportive of doing whatever it would take to ensure that they had enough water, that the tourists could come in, and the headlines weren't always, Cloudcroft out of the water, don't show up. So the owners of all the hotels and the restaurants and the business community seems to always have been on board with doing whatever it takes to ensure a guaranteed water supply for the village. The public in general seems to have a positive view of the project. What the village has done is, not every council meeting, but very often in council meetings, they'll discuss the project, and have opportunity for public input. And it seems to be that they, and of course maybe until it gets implemented and actually online, but there seems to be a lot of support for the project throughout the community now. There hasn't been negative articles in the newspaper. There's one council member that is not fully on board with the project. I think they're still kind of learning and trusting the technology, and an issue that Mr. Stomp brought up about operators being able to run the system. That seems to be maybe more of a focus on his particular concern. It seems like he trusts the technology, but can they, do they have the staff to run it, and what happens if something breaks down? And of course the design of the system is such that if any component were to produce off-spec water, so to speak, that would shut it down. So there's built-in protection and things like that within the system. And kind of on that topic of operability, they do have a level 4 water wastewater operator. He's not trained in these kind of technologies, but so he's going to be doing a couple of things, and that is get their operators training so that they can comfortably run the equipment. The vendors are supplying training programs to do this, but at the same time they're very seriously considering contract operations for maybe the first year or so, and hire operators that can run this equipment and have them on staff training as they go. And so in a year or two period, then their operators will be well trained. So that answers your question.
Maybe I can just add one point. I think one of the great benefits of having this summit and talking with other states, folks who have done reuse as well, is that there's a lot of experience to draw from, not all positive with public perception. I'm thinking of San Diego in particular. In the 90s, they demonstrated that it was all technologically possible. It was permitted. The public heard about this and was really against it, and the program shut down. And when they came back to do round 2, they learned from this lesson and had a really extensive public outreach effort that has really shifted the tide of support towards reuse. So I would encourage people who are considering this and starting to think about public perception to look at the research and experiences of other facilities, because I think we're starting to get a better blueprint for how that might take place.
Thank you all for your presentation. Bob Feinberg with RWL Water. John, I would direct this question to you, but I think it's taking place in California already. As the country starts seeing a revitalization and or new growth, new housing developments, is it prudent for, let's say, a Pulte or a Centex to look at a subdivision that they're purchasing 1,000 acres to build 5,000 homes, and in California that probably is a two-phase deal? Is it prudent for them to start considering on-site wastewater treatment of those communities that they're building new, and reuse of their own wastewater to send back to the community in some form or fashion with respect to landscaping and the like?
Well, I think that question, a lot of people are already doing that. Now, the state prohibits, like large-scale for example, to serve reuse water to residential development. So there was something that might have to change in the state regulations that would allow that to happen. So we're not allowed to serve an individual customer like a residential, some of our reuse water. So there may be a hurdle to get over there. I think you really need to look at the cost benefit and how much it's going to cost to operate, maintain, and then rehab and replace this system in the future to determine whether or not an on-site system of that small of a use or something much larger that can be tied into works better. But sure, reuse of any kind of effluent, like we were talking about, for us is going to be a benefit to reduce potable demands on the system for sure.
And so how would we compare what I just described and which you've answered to the purple pipe situation at Mesa del Sol?
Well, Mesa del Sol, again, is a large-scale type of development, so we've already invested in the infrastructure to get it there. For an individual homeowner or a system like that, it's going to be much more expensive. It's going to be much more costly for a group of homeowners, for example, to operate and maintain a system as opposed to something like we would operate and maintain. So I think that's going to be some cost prohibitive. And then what we've seen in the past is a lot of these small water systems or wastewater, or even something like you're talking about, a gray water system, over time they tend to lose focus. The rates kind of don't cover the operation of the system operation and maintenance goes down, and then they come back and they say, hey, Water Authority, can you guys take us over because the system's falling apart? So it's probably better to have the discussions up front about and planning for that up now than it is to wait 20 years until the system's falling apart and people are begging us to take it over or asking somebody else to take over the problem.
Thank you.